On the 8th of February 1587, the swing of an executioner's axe changed the face of history forever. Mary Queen of Scots made her way into the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle, and she had been ordered to be executed by her cousin Queen Elizabeth I. The Tudor Queen had signed her death warrant, and Mary is believed to have been involved in a number of plots that saw her plan against Elizabeth, and Mary wanted to take the throne of England for herself. She was a woman who had been imprisoned by Elizabeth for almost 2 decades. However, the execution of Mary Queen of Scots did not go very well, and it was not a clean job, as the executioner struggled to take off the head of the anointed queen. Following her death there were gasps with the crowds that saw, and her remains were then treated terribly, and she would then be buried in a place where she did not want to be buried, and she would also be exhumed later. But her execution took place to disgrace her. But what is the exact story of the ruthless execution of Mary Queen of Scots? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Mary Queen of Scots had been placed on trial inside of the very place where she would lose her head, and she was accused of treason, but she said that she had never been a subject of the English Queen, and as an anointed queen herself, she said there was no way she could be convicted of treason. But her involvement in the Babington plot condemned her to death, and this plot would have placed Mary on the throne of England if it had been successful. But this would have also seen the death of Elizabeth I, as the plotters planned to kill her. But this was foiled, and the plan was to then sentence Mary Queen of Scots to death. Following the trial, Elizabeth had a big problem, as she would differ on signing the death warrant of Mary, who was her first cousin. She was worrying about executing another woman who was a queen, and she would for the rest of her life consider this, and she believed in her own final days that Mary's execution would prevent her getting into heaven. But Mary would be held inside of Fotheringhay, and on the 7th of February 1587, she was told the next day she would be executed. Messengers arrived to pass on this, and that evening she spent her final moments in prayer, and made arrangements to distribute her possessions to the women of her household, and she also crafted her final letters and also her will. But whilst this was occurring, inside of Fotheringhay Castle's Great Hall, there was a huge transformation taking place, as a room where banquets would be held would become an execution chamber. The platform and scaffold which was in the centre of the room was where the execution would take place, and the block was found on the platform which Mary would rest her head on, and then the axe would come down upon her. The scaffold was decorated in black cloth to mark the moment, and there were 3 steps to climb onto the scaffold, and also a cushion for Mary to kneel on. There were 3 stools for her and other witnesses, including the Earl of Shrewsbury and Kent, who would sit on them. The executioner was a man named Bull, who was considered skilled, and he had been fetched along with his assistant to get to Fotheringhay quickly, to perform the job of taking Mary's head off her shoulders. The next morning the time came for Mary Queen of Scots to meet her executioner, and she spent many years locked up, and she felt liberated by her execution. She believed that her time had now come to transition into heaven, and that before she was just existing and not living. She entered the great hall with quiet, calm and dignity, and this surprised the witnesses, and 2 of the female attendants remained with her. One detailed account of her execution tells what happened, and it stated that, "Here Mary Queen of Scots' prayers being ended, the executioners kneeling desired her grace to forgive them her death, who answered, I forgive you with all my heart, for now, I hope, you shall make an end of all my troubles." Then they, with her 2 women helping her up, began to disrobe her of her apparel. Then she lay her crucifix upon the stool. One of her executioners took from her neck the Agnus Dei, which she, laying hands off it, gave to one of her women, and told the executioner he should be answered money for it. Then she suffered them, with her 2 women, to disrobe her of her chain of pomander beads, and all other her apparel, most willingly, and with joy rather than sorrow, helped to make herself unready, putting on a pair of sleeves with her own hands, which they had pulled off, and that with some haste, as if she had longed to be gone. All this time they were pulling off her apparel, she never changed her countenance, but with a smiling cheer she uttered these words, that she never had such grooms to make her unready, and that she never put off her clothes before such a company. Then she, being stripped of all her apparel, saving her petticoat and kirtle, her 2 women beholding her great lamentation and crying and crossing themselves, prayed in Latin. Then she, with a smiling countenance, turning to her manservants, as Melvin and the rest standing upon a bench, nigh the scaffold, who sometime weeping, sometime crying out loud, and continually crossing themselves, prayed in Latin, crossing them with her hand, bade them farewell, and wishing them to pray for her, even until the last hour. This done, one of the women, having a Corpus Christi cloth, lapped up 3-corner ways, kissing it, put it over the Queen of Scots' face, and pinned it fast to the caul of her head. Then the 2 women departed from her, and she kneeling down upon the cushion most resolutely, without any token of fear or death, she spake aloud the psalm in Latin, In te Domine confido, non confidar in aeternum. Then groping for the block, she laid down her head, putting her chin over the block with both her hands, which holding there still, had been cut off, had they not have been espied. Then lying upon the block most quietly and stretching out her arms, cried, In manus tuus Domine, 3 or 4 times. Then she, lying very still upon the block, one of the executioners holding her slightly with one of his hands, she endured 2 strokes of the other executioner with an axe, and she making very small noise or none at all, and not stirring any part from her place where she lay, and so the executioner cut off her head, saving one little gristle, which being cut asunder, he lift up her head to the view of all the assembly, and bade God save the Queen. Then her dress of lawn falling from off her head, it appeared as grey as one of the 60 years old, polled very short, her face in a moment being so much altered from the form she had when she was alive, as few could remember her from her dead face. Her lips stirred up and down for a quarter of an hour after her head was cut off. Then Mr. Dean, Dr. Fletcher, the Dean of Peterborough, said with a loud voice, So perish all of the Queen's enemies. And afterwards the Earl of Kent came to the dead body, and standing over it, with a loud voice said, Such end of all the Queen, and the Gospel's enemies. Then one of the executioners pulling off her garters espied her little dog, which was crept under her clothes, which could not be gotten by force, but by force, yet afterwards would not depart from the dead corpse, but came and lay between her head and her shoulders, which being imbued with the blood of her was carried away and washed, as all things else that had been covered in her blood were either burned or washed, and the executioners sent away with money for their fees, not having anything that belonged unto her. And so every man being commanded out of the hall, except the sheriff and his men, she was carried by them up into the great chamber, lying ready for the surgeons to embalm her. As mentioned, the execution of Mary Queen of Scots did not go well. An execution during the Tudor period was considered successful if it was performed in one swift blow of the axe. The axe was considered less reliable than the sword, but the haste of the execution of Mary would result in a swordsman not being able to be fetched from places in Europe. Many also would probably not have wanted to take the job of executing a Catholic queen. But the first blow of the axe missed Mary's neck completely, and the axe hit the back of her head, and this caused a huge amount of pain and suffering. This could even have knocked her out, but the second blow found its target, and this almost took the Queen's head clean off, but for one piece of sinew, which held the head onto the body. Following this, the executioner sawed through the sinew, and he then picked up her head, and Mary's wig slipped off, and her head fell onto the floor. It was a shocking and botched sight, and was not the end for a queen who had a huge role in the history of the 16th century. Mary would then, following this, be embalmed, and she was left inside of the presence chamber in Fotheringhay, whilst preparations were made for her burial. But in one final act of disgrace, Mary Queen of Scots would be buried in a Protestant ceremony, against her wishes, and she would be buried inside of Peterborough Cathedral. But she would later be moved during the reign of her son. She was then buried in a huge ornate tomb in Westminster Abbey. Queen Elizabeth I would, until her dying day, regret signing off on the execution of Mary Queen of Scots. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.